Sir, that seat already belongs to someone who actually paid for first class. The sentence sliced through the quiet cabin just as Naomi Carter stepped into row 2, carrying nothing more than a black leather backpack and the calm confidence of someone who had spent an entire lifetime refusing to let strangers define her worth. Every conversation around her seemed to pause. Champagne glasses stopped halfway to waiting lips. Laptop screens froze. Even the gentle hum of the aircraft's air conditioning suddenly felt louder as dozens of eyes shifted toward the woman standing in a simple charcoal sweater, dark jeans, and white sneakers. Flight 728 from New York to Los Angeles was scheduled to push back in less than 20 minutes, and the premium cabin had settled into the polished rhythm every frequent traveler expected. Soft lighting reflected across brushed aluminum trim. The scent of fresh coffee drifted from the galley. Expensive watches glimmered beneath tailored sleeves. It looked like every advertisement promising luxury at 35,000 feet. Then everything changed because seat 2A was no longer empty. A middle-aged white businessman in a tailored navy suit leaned comfortably against the window, one polished shoe resting over the opposite knee as though he had occupied the seat his entire life. His expensive carry-on was already tucked neatly into the overhead bin directly above Naomi's boarding position. He barely glanced at her before smiling at the flight attendant standing beside him. "See," he said casually. "I told you she'd eventually figure out she was in the wrong cabin." The flight attendant returned a practiced smile before turning toward Naomi. "Ma'am," she said, her voice pleasant enough to sound rehearsed but firm enough to leave no room for discussion. "I'm going to ask you to continue toward economy. This passenger is already seated." Naomi looked briefly at the overhead display. Row 2. Seat A window. Exactly where her boarding pass directed her. She lowered her eyes to the digital pass glowing on her phone before raising them again without the slightest hint of frustration. "I believe that's my seat," she answered quietly. The businessman chuckled under his breath. That's becoming a popular line these days. A few nearby passengers exchanged uncertain glances. One elderly woman slowly removed her reading glasses. A young software engineer across the aisle discreetly paused the podcast playing through his earbuds. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The flight attendant folded her hands politely. "Ma'am, I really don't want to delay departure over a misunderstanding." Naomi remained perfectly still. She had learned years ago that silence often exposed more truth than anger ever could. The attendant extended her hand. "May I see your boarding pass again?" Naomi handed over her phone without hesitation. The attendant glanced at the screen for barely 2 seconds before shaking her head. "This doesn't appear to match our current seating assignment." The businessman smiled wider, settling deeper into the leather seat as though the matter had already been decided. "Some people just don't know when to admit they're wrong," he muttered loudly enough for several nearby passengers to hear. Naomi calmly accepted her phone back. She looked once around the elegant first-class cabin, taking in every polished surface, every attentive face, every uniform stitched with the airline's familiar logo. She had walked onto this airplane expecting to inspect customer service. Instead, within less than a minute, she had discovered something far more revealing. And no one aboard, not the passengers, not the crew, and certainly not the man comfortably occupying seat 2A, had the slightest idea whose airline they were preparing to fly. Naomi Carter did not reach for another seat, and she did not raise her voice. Instead, she looked once more at the cabin around her with the patient expression of someone collecting evidence rather than searching for sympathy. There was a reason she had boarded this flight dressed like any ordinary traveler. 18 months earlier, Apex Aviation Group had completed the largest acquisition in its history by purchasing Horizon National Airlines. Wall Street celebrated the numbers. Financial analysts praised the strategy. Shareholders applauded the growth. Yet Naomi cared far less about quarterly reports than she did about a different set of numbers quietly appearing inside customer complaints. Over the previous 6 months, hundreds of reports described passengers who claimed they had been judged by their clothing, questioned because of their appearance, or treated as though they had not earned the right to sit in premium cabins. Every investigation ended the same way. Internal reviews concluded that employees had simply followed company procedures. The paperwork always looked clean. The stories never did. Naomi had read every complaint herself. She remembered each one because too many of them sounded painfully familiar. She believed policies could be rewritten overnight, but culture only revealed itself when people thought nobody important was watching. That was why she never traveled with executives, assistants, photographers, or corporate security during these inspections. She purchased her own ticket using her legal name. She boarded with everyone else. She carried her own backpack. She wanted employees to see an ordinary black woman before they ever imagined they might be looking at the person responsible for their paychecks. This morning had started before sunrise in Manhattan. She had walked 3 blocks to a neighborhood coffee shop instead of requesting a chauffeur. She chose comfortable clothes instead of designer labels because appearance should never determine the quality of service. Her executive assistant, Claire Morgan, had asked one final question before Naomi entered the terminal. "Do you want corporate operations monitoring this flight from the beginning?" Naomi smiled and declined. "Only if they give me a reason." Claire understood immediately. Their system remained silent unless Naomi activated it herself. Meanwhile, inside the aircraft, the businessman relaxed even further into the seat by the window. He reached for the glass of sparkling water waiting on the tray table as though the conversation had already ended in his favor. The flight attendant glanced toward the boarding door where more first-class passengers continued entering, each one slowing just enough to notice the unusual scene before finding their assigned seats. Time was becoming pressure. Every delayed minute increased the temptation to solve the situation quickly instead of correctly. Naomi recognized that pattern as well. People under pressure often revealed their deepest assumptions. The attendant offered another polite smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Ma'am, I am asking for your cooperation." Naomi answered with the same steady tone she had used from the beginning. "I am cooperating. I am simply waiting for the seating record to be verified." The businessman laughed softly. "You are making this much harder than it needs to be." Naomi turned toward him for the first time since boarding. There was no anger in her expression, only quiet curiosity. "Sometimes," she said gently, "the easiest answer is also the least accurate." Around them, the cabin settled into an uneasy silence. Without realizing it, everyone aboard had become part of a test that only one passenger knew had begun before the airplane ever left the gate. The senior flight attendant inhaled slowly before tapping her tablet a second time. Her confident smile faded for only an instant, then returned even sharper than before. "There is no active record showing you assigned to this seat," she announced loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Our system is very clear." Naomi watched the screen without trying to look at it herself. "Systems only tell the truth when people allow them to," she replied. The businessman beside the window let out a quiet laugh and folded his newspaper across his lap. "I fly every week," he said proudly. "I know exactly how this works. People see an empty premium seat and hope nobody notices." His words drifted across the cabin like permission. A man across the aisle nodded slightly before returning to his laptop. Another passenger whispered something into her husband's ear while stealing another glance toward Naomi. The assumptions spread faster than facts ever could. The senior flight attendant pressed the interphone. "Captain, we have a seating issue in first class. We may require assistance before departure." Less than a minute later, the lead purser emerged from the forward galley wearing the polished expression of someone accustomed to resolving complaints quickly. His name tag read Daniel Brooks. He greeted the businessman with a friendly nod before turning toward Naomi. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I understand there has been some confusion." Naomi answered calmly. "There is no confusion on my side. My boarding pass assigns me to seat 2 Alpha." Daniel extended his hand. "May I verify it?" She handed him her phone. He studied the digital boarding pass for only a moment before returning it. "Our current manifest does not match this assignment." Naomi noticed something interesting. Neither employee had scanned her pass again. Neither had requested a fresh verification from the boarding system. Both had simply accepted the information already displayed on one device without questioning whether it might be incomplete. She had seen organizations fail exactly this way. They stopped investigating the moment an answer confirmed what they already believed. The businessman adjusted his expensive blazer and smiled toward Daniel. "I appreciate you handling this professionally." Daniel nodded politely before facing Naomi again. "If you would allow us to reseat you today, we will gladly provide a travel credit for the inconvenience." Naomi looked directly into his eyes. "I am not asking for compensation. I am asking for accuracy." The surrounding silence grew heavier. Boarding continued behind them, but every passenger entering first class slowed down just enough to observe the exchange before pretending not to watch. Near the galley, a young flight attendant named Emily Brooks stood quietly with a service tablet in her hands. She had assisted during boarding only minutes earlier. Something about the conversation pulled at her memory. She remembered watching a passenger named Naomi Carter scan successfully through the priority boarding lane. She remembered the green confirmation on the gate monitor. More importantly, she remembered hearing another crew member mention Seat 2 Alpha before passengers ever stepped onto the aircraft. Emily frowned slightly, but remained silent. She was only 3 months into the job, and challenging senior crew members was not something new. Employees did lightly. Meanwhile, Daniel took one careful step closer. "Ma'am, delaying departure affects every passenger on board. I need your cooperation." Naomi answered with the same measured voice that had never once risen above conversation level. "Departure delays are temporary. Losing trust lasts much longer." Daniel paused. Those words landed differently than he expected. Yet before he could respond, the businessman leaned forward with growing confidence. "Some people always want exceptions," he said, shaking his head. "Rules only matter until they become inconvenient." Naomi turned toward him with quiet composure. "Rules protect everyone," she said. "Assumptions protect no one." The cabin fell still once again, but beneath that polished silence, invisible fault lines had already begun spreading through Horizon National Airlines without anyone realizing the true test had only just entered its most revealing stage. Emily Brooks could no longer ignore the feeling growing in the back of her mind. She looked toward the boarding door where the last first-class passengers had already settled into their seats. Then she looked back at Naomi Carter, who still stood calmly beside row 2 without the slightest trace of panic or frustration. It did not make sense. During boarding, Emily had personally watched the priority scanner flash green beside Naomi's name. She remembered it because the passenger had smiled politely, thanked the gate agent, and quietly continued down the jet bridge without asking for special treatment. Emily also remembered seeing Seat 2 Alpha listed beside that same name when she reviewed the welcome manifest only minutes before boarding began. Something had changed between the gate and the cabin, and nobody else seemed interested in asking why. She took one cautious step toward Daniel. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I think we should verify the original boarding record one more time." Daniel barely turned his head. "We already have the seating information." Emily hesitated. "I understand, but I remember seeing her assignment during boarding." The senior flight attendant immediately answered before Daniel could respond. "You are remembering the wrong passenger." Emily frowned. She knew she was not. Before she could continue, the businessman smiled confidently. "These things happen all the time. New employees get confused." A few passengers nodded as though the explanation sounded reasonable. Naomi remained silent. She simply watched every decision unfold exactly as it was being made. Across the aisle, an older white woman slowly closed the novel she had been reading. "Young lady," she said to Emily, "if you remember something different, perhaps it deserves another look." Her calm voice broke through the growing tension without adding to it. A man wearing a Chicago Cubs cap, sitting one row behind, leaned forward. "It would only take another minute to scan the boarding pass again," he added. "That seems easier than arguing." Daniel glanced briefly toward the departure clock displayed on his tablet. Every passing minute increased the pressure to close the aircraft door. The senior flight attendant shook her head. "We cannot keep delaying the flight because someone refuses to accept the seating assignment." Naomi finally spoke. "I have accepted my seating assignment. I am simply asking that it be verified through the same system that assigned it." Her voice remained steady, almost gentle. The older woman nodded slowly. "That sounds fair to me." Emily looked from Naomi to Daniel once again. "Please," she said carefully, "let me check the original boarding log." For a brief second, Daniel looked uncertain. Then the senior flight attendant answered for him. "There is nothing else to check." Those words settled over the cabin like a door quietly closing. Several passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Even those who had initially assumed Naomi must be mistaken now seemed less certain. They were no longer watching a disagreement over a seat. They were watching people refuse to answer a simple question. Naomi noticed the change immediately. Public opinion rarely shifted because of dramatic speeches. It shifted when ordinary people recognized that fairness had quietly disappeared from the room. Emily lowered her eyes for only a moment before making a decision she knew might affect her career. She looked directly at Daniel and spoke clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear. I remember the name Naomi Carter on seat 2 Alpha. I am willing to state that formally if necessary. The cabin became perfectly still. No one applauded. No one gasped. But for the first time since Naomi stepped onto the aircraft, the certainty that had surrounded the crew began to crack, and the truth finally had its first witness. Daniel looked at Emily for several long seconds, weighing experience against certainty. The silence inside the cabin had become almost tangible. Every passenger seemed to understand that whatever happened next would reveal far more than the ownership of one seat. The senior flight attendant broke the pause with an impatient sigh. Emily, return to the galley. This is no longer your responsibility. Emily did not move. With respect, she answered quietly. I believe it became my responsibility the moment I remembered what I saw. The businessman shook his head with a faint smile. You are risking your career over someone you have never met. Emily replied without taking her eyes off Daniel. I am risking it over something I know. Those words lingered in the air. Daniel glanced toward Naomi once more, expecting frustration or demands. Instead, he found only calm. She stood beside the aisle with relaxed shoulders, her backpack resting neatly at her feet exactly where she had placed it after boarding. She had not interrupted anyone. She had not accused anyone. She had simply continued asking for the same thing from the beginning. Verify the record. The senior flight attendant reached toward the overhead compartment above seat 2 Alpha. Since you will not be occupying this row, we need to clear the space for the confirmed passenger. Without waiting for permission, she removed Naomi's backpack and placed it carefully in the aisle beside her. The action was polite on the surface, yet it carried a message every witness understood. The decision had already been made. Naomi bent down, lifted her backpack, and set it upright beside her once again without a word. The businessman leaned back comfortably. Thank you, he said to the crew. Now perhaps we can finally leave on time. As his voice faded, an old memory quietly surfaced in Naomi's mind. 20 years earlier, she had boarded a regional flight wearing inexpensive jeans after finishing a week of engineering work at a manufacturing plant outside Detroit. A gate employee had studied her clothing before asking twice whether she belonged in the premium boarding lane. She remembered the puzzled expressions, the careful smiles, and the assumption that someone who looked like her must have misunderstood the process. She had eventually reached her seat that day, but the feeling stayed with her far longer than the flight itself. It became one more reminder that dignity could be questioned long before identity ever was. Standing in this cabin now, she realized how little the script had changed. Different uniforms, different airline, different decade, the same quiet assumptions. Daniel finally spoke. Ma'am, if you continue refusing reassignment, airport customer service may need to assist after we return to the gate. Naomi nodded slightly. If that is the direction you choose, I will remain here until the facts are verified. Her answer surprised several passengers. There was no challenge in her voice, only confidence. The older woman across the aisle folded her hands. She has asked for verification from the beginning, she said calmly. Why is everyone avoiding such a simple step? A few heads nodded in agreement. Even the man wearing the Chicago Cubs cap looked toward Daniel expectantly. The atmosphere inside the cabin had shifted again. This was no longer one traveler standing alone against an airline crew. Quiet doubt had begun spreading through the first-class cabin, and with every unanswered request to verify the truth, the confidence of those who believed appearances more than evidence grew a little weaker. Daniel looked toward the closed cockpit door, then back at Naomi. He knew the situation had gone beyond a routine seating dispute, yet pride and procedure had become tangled together. Before he could speak again, Naomi reached into the pocket of her sweater and removed her phone. She unlocked it, tapped a single contact, and held it to her ear. She did not step away from the aisle. She did not lower her voice. Good afternoon, Claire, she said with the same calm tone she had carried from the moment she boarded. Please activate Flight Protocol 7. There was a brief pause before Claire Morgan answered immediately. Understood. Do you want corporate operations, ethics, legal, and executive security notified? Naomi glanced around the cabin. Yes. Begin with operations. Then request a live review of the boarding record for Flight 728 before departure. I will remain on board. It will be done, Claire replied without asking another question. Naomi ended the call and slipped the phone back into her pocket. The conversation had lasted less than 30 seconds, yet something about it unsettled everyone nearby. The businessman forced a small laugh. Calling a lawyer already? Naomi met his eyes. No, I called someone who can verify the facts. Daniel folded his arms. Ma'am, customer service cannot override the flight crew while boarding is in progress. Naomi nodded politely. You are correct. They cannot. Her answer was so measured that Daniel found himself unexpectedly uncertain. Across the aisle, the older woman watched Naomi with growing curiosity. She had seen angry travelers before. She had seen entitled travelers before. This woman was neither. She spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who expected systems to function because she understood exactly how they were built. Emily remained near the galley, unable to shake the feeling that the name Naomi Carter meant something she should remember. She quietly opened the internal employee directory on her service tablet, intending only to confirm the boarding sequence she had seen earlier. Instead, the device displayed an unexpected message. Access temporarily unavailable. Please wait for system synchronization. Emily frowned. She had never seen that notice before. At the same moment, Daniel's tablet refreshed automatically. Several menu icons briefly disappeared before reloading. He assumed it was a routine network update, but the timing felt strangely unusual. In an operations center hundreds of miles away, secure notifications had already begun, appearing across multiple executive dashboards. A boarding verification request marked priority executive had entered the system with authorization levels almost no employee had ever seen activated during a commercial flight. Compliance officers paused their meetings. Corporate operations requested the original gate scan logs. The ethics office opened a live incident file. No alarms sounded. No emergency announcements were made. The response unfolded quietly, methodically, almost invisibly. Back inside the aircraft, none of the passengers knew any of this was happening. They only noticed that the confidence of the flight crew no longer seemed as solid as it had a few minutes earlier. The businessman shifted in his seat for the first time. This is getting ridiculous, he muttered. It is one seat. Naomi looked toward the cabin windows where airport vehicles moved steadily across the afternoon ramp. It stopped being about one seat the moment no one wanted to confirm the truth, she answered gently. The words settled over the cabin with remarkable weight. Daniel looked once more at his tablet as another silent notification appeared across the top of the screen. It contained only 6 words, but they immediately erased every trace of certainty from his face. Await executive verification before passenger reassignment. Daniel stared at the notification for several seconds before reading it again, hoping he had misunderstood the message. The words had not changed. Await executive verification before passenger reassignment. His training had prepared him for weather delays, medical situations, and mechanical inspections, but not for an executive authorization arriving in the middle of an ordinary boarding process. The senior flight attendant stepped closer and lowered her voice. What is it? Daniel hesitated before quietly turning the screen toward her. Her confident expression faded almost immediately. That has to be a mistake, she whispered. Before either of them could speak again, every service tablet carried by the cabin crew refreshed at the same moment. Emily looked down instinctively. The employee directory had reopened automatically, displaying a highlighted executive profile. A photograph appeared on the screen. The woman in the picture wore a navy business suit instead of a charcoal sweater, but the face was unmistakable. Emily felt her heart skip. Beneath the photograph were the words Chief Executive Officer, Apex Aviation Group. She slowly raised her eyes toward Naomi, then back to the screen, as though expecting the image to disappear. It did not. The older passenger across the aisle noticed Emily's expression. Is something wrong? She asked gently. Emily answered almost without thinking. No, she whispered. Something has finally become very clear. At that exact moment, Daniel's tablet chimed once more. An encrypted video request appeared with the highest executive priority available inside the company. He accepted it automatically. The screen filled with the familiar face of Claire Morgan, Executive Chief of Staff. Her voice remained professional and composed. Good afternoon. This is corporate operations. Before Flight 728 departs, we require immediate confirmation that Ms. Naomi Carter has not been reassigned from Seat 2 Alpha without documented verification. Please answer yes or no." Daniel felt every eye in first class settling on him. "Yes," he admitted quietly. Claire nodded once. "Thank you for your honesty. Please understand that Ms. Carter is not only the passenger assigned to that seat. She is also the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Aviation Group, the parent company that owns Horizon National Airlines. She is conducting an unannounced executive service review. Effective immediately, preserve all boarding records and continue no further action until executive compliance joins this call." Silence swept through the cabin with a force no raised voice could have matched. The businessman's confident smile disappeared completely. He looked from Daniel to Naomi, then back again, searching for some sign that this had to be a misunderstanding. There was none. Naomi remained exactly where she had been standing from the beginning, calm, patient, and dignified. She had never needed to announce who she was. She had only asked that the facts be checked. Emily lowered her tablet and quietly exhaled. The older woman across the aisle smiled softly, not because someone powerful had been revealed, but because the truth had finally caught up with the assumptions. Daniel stepped toward Naomi with visible humility. Before he could speak, Naomi gently raised one hand. "Please," she said, "there will be time for conversations later. Right now, I only want everyone here to remember one thing. None of this required knowing my title. The correct decision should have been made when I was simply another passenger holding a valid boarding pass." No one answered. No one needed to. In the stillness of the first-class cabin, every person present understood that the most important revelation had never been who Naomi Carter was. It was how differently she had been treated before anyone knew. No one moved for several long moments. The elegant first-class cabin, which only minutes earlier had echoed with quiet certainty and polished confidence, now felt transformed by a single undeniable truth. Daniel lowered his tablet and took a slow breath before addressing Naomi with genuine humility. "Miss Carter, I owe you a sincere apology. We failed to give you the fairness every passenger deserves." Naomi acknowledged his words with a slight nod. "I appreciate the apology," she answered. "But apologies only matter if they become improvements." Claire Morgan's voice continued through the secure video connection. "Corporate compliance has already secured the boarding records. The original gate scan confirms that Ms. Carter was correctly assigned to Seat 2 Alpha from the moment her ticket was issued. There was never any legitimate reason to question her assignment." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Every decision made after Naomi boarded had been built upon assumptions instead of verification. The businessman sitting beside the window slowly stood up. The confidence that had defined him throughout the encounter had completely disappeared. He looked at Naomi before speaking. "I owe you an apology as well. I made judgments I should never have made." Naomi looked at him calmly. "Thank you for saying that. The important question is whether you will remember this the next time you meet someone whose story you do not know." He lowered his eyes and quietly nodded. Without another word, he removed his briefcase from the overhead compartment and stepped into the aisle. Daniel checked the updated seating record one final time before gesturing respectfully toward the window seat. "Seat 2 Alpha is ready whenever you are." Naomi did not sit immediately. Instead, she turned toward Emily. "What is your full name?" The young flight attendant looked surprised. "Emily Brooks, ma'am." Naomi smiled warmly. "Emily, today you reminded everyone on this airplane that integrity does not depend on seniority. It depends on the willingness to speak when something does not feel right." Emily felt emotion rising in her throat. "I almost stayed quiet," she admitted. "Almost," Naomi replied gently. "But you did not." Several passengers smiled. The older woman across the aisle softly applauded once, and a few others quietly joined her. It was not applause for wealth or authority. It was recognition for honesty. Naomi then looked toward the entire cabin. Every airline invests millions of dollars in aircraft, technology, and premium service, she said. Those investments matter. But the most valuable asset any company has is trust. Trust is created one conversation at a time, one decision at a time, and one passenger at a time. The moment people believe appearances are more important than facts, trust begins to disappear. No one interrupted her. Even the cabin crew listened with complete attention. Claire spoke once more through the tablet. "Ms. Carter, executive compliance recommends delaying departure until a replacement crew can arrive if you believe that is appropriate. Naomi considered the suggestion for only a moment before shaking her head. No, everyone here has already learned more from this experience than another delay could possibly teach. Let the flight continue. The review will continue as well, but it will continue through accountability, not humiliation. Daniel looked visibly relieved, but he also understood that the real work had only begun. Policies could be revised. Reports could be written. Additional training could be scheduled. Yet changing a culture required something much deeper than paperwork. As Naomi finally placed her backpack into the overhead compartment above seat 2 Alpha and settled into the window seat that had belonged to her from the very beginning, the aircraft remained exactly where it had started, still waiting at the gate, but every person inside it had already arrived somewhere entirely different. The aircraft door finally closed, and a quiet sense of purpose settled over the cabin. As the engines slowly came to life, the conversations that had filled first class only minutes earlier disappeared, replaced by thoughtful silence. Some passengers looked out the windows at the busy airport below, while others found themselves replaying every moment they had just witnessed. They had boarded expecting nothing more than another cross-country flight. Instead, they had received a lesson that would remain with them long after the landing. Naomi Carter opened her laptop only after the airplane began taxiing. She did not review financial forecasts or shareholder reports. Instead, she opened a document titled Passenger Experience Review. Beneath the heading, she typed a single sentence. Character is measured by what we do before we know who someone is. She paused for a moment before continuing with detailed observations from the flight. She praised Emily Brooks for demonstrating courage despite her limited experience. She acknowledged Daniel's willingness to accept responsibility once the facts became clear. She also documented every moment when assumptions had been accepted without verification. Her goal was never to punish individuals. It was to eliminate the conditions that allowed those decisions to happen in the first place. Several weeks later, Horizon National Airlines introduced a company-wide initiative requiring every employee, from gate agents to senior executives, to complete a new customer dignity program built around one simple principle. Verify before you judge. The training included real situations, practical decision-making exercises, and reminders that every passenger deserved the same respect regardless of appearance, age, race, clothing, or social status. Emily received a personal invitation to corporate headquarters, where she accepted a new position helping develop future customer service training. Daniel remained with the airline as well, choosing to mentor younger crew members by sharing the experience openly rather than hiding from it. He often told new employees that confidence without curiosity could become a dangerous combination. The businessman who had occupied seat 2 Alpha also carried the lesson with him. Months later, while waiting at another airport, he noticed an older traveler quietly being questioned about access to an airport lounge. Instead of assuming the staff must be correct, he politely suggested that the membership be verified before any conclusions were made. The misunderstanding was resolved within moments. As he watched the traveler enter the lounge with a grateful smile, he realized that one better decision could begin with a single memory. Naomi never publicly discussed what happened on Flight 728. There were no interviews, no press releases, and no social media announcements celebrating the incident. She believed lasting change rarely came from embarrassing people. It came from helping them recognize what they had overlooked and giving them the opportunity to choose differently next time. Every time she boarded another flight, she continued traveling exactly the same way, carrying only a backpack, wearing comfortable clothes, and expecting nothing more than the fairness every passenger deserved. Because titles can open doors, but dignity should never require one. And perhaps that is the lesson worth remembering. The strongest people do not prove their value by revealing their power. They reveal the character of everyone around them long before they ever mention who they are. In the end, the most important seat on that airplane was never seat 2 Alpha. It was the place where every person had to decide whether they would trust appearances or choose fairness, because justice begins the moment we treat every stranger with the respect we hope to receive ourselves.